Massachusetts Speaker of the House, Ron Mariano, is our guest. He's led the State House through a full year of pandemic pivots. In 2022, he'll see the exit of one governor and the election of the next. Speaker Mariano is here. Let's go on the record.
From WCVB Channel 5, the inside word from Washington to Beacon Hill. Today's newsmakers are going on the record.
Welcome to OTR. I'm Janet Wu, along with News Center 5 political reporter Sharma Sacchetti. Ed Harding is off this week. We're pleased to have House Speaker Ron Mariano with us. He took the gavel last December and has already said he'd like to keep it through 2023. He's a Democrat from Quincy, first taking office as a state rep in 1991. He holds the degrees from Northeastern and Boston University. Thank you very much for being with us here, Mr. Mariano. The pandemic, it's been a pretty tough period for all of us. And, you have told everyone about having health problems, but you look great today. So are you out of the woods? Everything great?
Well, yeah, I feel great. My energy is back. I feel strong. I'm back exercising on a regular basis, so I feel good.
You're ready for 2022.
Ready to go. Ready to go.
All right, we want to start off with the ARPA funding.
Sure, okay.
It was a long-awaited $4 billion bill to spend federal pandemic money. The governor, however, not happy with some of the red tape. He says at stake new housing and bonuses for low-income frontline workers. Do you think the governor is wrong?
Well, the issue is we weren't in a position to administer a program of $500 million into frontline workers. We didn't have a mechanism in which to get that money into the hands of the folks that needed it, and the governor did. So we left a lot of the responsibility to the governor. Now, there's no time frame on this, and we understood it would be a pretty big task for him to identify the folks who get money, how much they get, and to get it into their hands. So we knew it was a big task, so we're not surprised by the fact that he is raising that issue.
But he has said that the legislature put in too many parameters of who he has to consult before he does anything, and it's going to take a long period of time, and he really wants to get the money into their hands.
Well, the issue isn't getting the money out as much as it is, let's get it into the hands of the people who are on the front lines and make sure they're the ones that get the money. And through this whole process, we handled the ARPA money totally different from the way the governor did, because we wanted to make sure that this money got into the hands of the people who needed it the most.
But are you asking him to consult too many people before he actually does it?
I don't believe so, no. I think that I'd rather err on the side of getting this money into the hands of the people who went to work every day, who drove the buses, who served in the booths at the subway. Those are the people that need these bonuses.
Okay, the Secretary of State was sitting in your chair just a few weeks ago, and he called the House redistricting map, quote, an incumbency protection plan not meant to help more racial minorities win seats in the Commonwealth. He points to one Cambridge precinct with 3 state reps, 2 state senators, and 2 members of Congress. Is he right about this?
Far from it. I think that what we have with us in this redistricting is an opportunity for change in the makeup of the Massachusetts legislature. The issue about redistricting that people forget is that we didn't get our federal numbers till late. We were under a time pressure to meet certain deadlines, and the committee that put together the redistricting plan did a great job of holding public hearings that included voters, included potential candidates, and included incumbents, all in a public hearing. They came up with the maps. The Secretary of State could have waited in approving some of the precinct changes in the cities and towns that he has to make.
He did say he did go to legislative leaders like Chairman Moran, as well as you, to try to make some changes. Now that you've heard his criticism, do you think you could have done a better job? No,
I believe that if he had decided to work with us a little bit and delayed his approval of the precinct changes, we could have had a finely tuned map as we did 10 years ago. I think what we have here is him sticking to a timeline that we couldn't maintain because of the late federal release of the census numbers.
I want to ask you about vote by mail. The House is sitting on a bill to permanently expand voting rights, mail-in voting, early voting. The Senate approved the bill, and a half dozen communities holding elections now have lost those opportunities. So what is holding up the House?
We've already voted on those two things. We did it in June. We sent it over to the Senate. The Senate chose not to take it up because they wanted to expand a bill with other things. We haven't debated those other things in the Senate bill. They haven't even come up in the House yet. So we are waiting to put a bill together that will include this. I've been committed publicly saying that I want to support both those items, and I will. The fact of the matter is, though, that the Senate chose to go in a different direction after we had already approved these things.
What specifically is the sticking point here?
The sticking point is we haven't discussed a lot of the things that were in the Senate bill yet.
So when are we going to see the bill?
Well, sometime before the term expires, I would expect we'd deal with that. Right now, there's no election affected by either one of these two. So,
What there are special elections that are going on that have been affected.
but neither one of them will be affected by this because the Boncory primary occurs before the order expires,
Right.
And there is no final election
Because there's
So,
no Republican
yeah,
that's running.
yeah.
Okay, the Boston mayoral race put a spotlight on Mass and Cass, and it was a homeless problem that was basically created when the bridge to Long Island was closed. As House Speaker and also as a Quincy resident, should the state step in to help alleviate this problem, and should the bridge be rebuilt and reopened? And should Quincy or any other cities and towns help solve this problem, or is it just solely Boston's problem? I know, that's a lot of questions. That's a lot.
Where do you want me to start? Look, it's a political issue in Quincy. There is no doubt about it. The mayor does not support the reopening of the bridge. My fellow reps from Quincy do not support the opening of the bridge.
And you don't?
I really haven't taken a position. I am concerned about the cost of the bridge, and I am concerned about why the city of Boston chose to tear it down almost unilaterally, which has always bothered me. The former mayor and I did have a discussion about that. And I do think that the space that the hospital occupied and the services that are provided for homeless folks is missed. It's no doubt about it that it's had an impact on what went on at Mass and Cass. That's not to say, though, that there aren't other ways to address this problem.
Should Quincy take some of these homeless
Should everyone in the
folks,
Commonwealth take
Right,
some of
right.
these folks? I think that's a fair proposal. But everyone should share in equally in finding a spot for these folks who need help.
I want to ask you about the State House. It's still closed, even though most buildings, public buildings in Massachusetts, do remain somewhat open. Now, children who annually sing during the holidays, they're relegated now to outdoors. In fact, the House refused to loan one Sudbury Middle School choir chairs or access to the bathrooms just last week. Why?
Well, I'm not familiar with that lack of access to the bathroom. I don't know. I do know that they were singing over by Ashburton Place, where the Secretary of State has some office buildings and some offices. He could have let them use those facilities, and I think that's what ended up happening.
Why is the building still closed?
The building is closed because we are concerned about the safety of about 600 folks who work there. If you recall, when the vaccinations first became popular, I had 5 bills filed that wanted to prevent me from asking folks to be vaccinated. We have a segment of the population that are elected that would be in jeopardy health-wise if they come into the building and refuse to be vaccinated. They haven't declared whether or not they're vaccinated or not. And at the same time, it's a public building. It's a public building that houses the House, the Senate, the governor, and all the constitutional offices, and all the people that work there. my concern is their public safety and their health their health needs. And what is also left out of the whole equation is this is a stop on the Freedom Trail. And we'll be welcoming in visitors from all over the world. How are we going to deal with their vaccinations? How are we going to determine who comes in and who doesn't come in? And those are the things we're moving through. We have a plan. We have a committee that put a plan together. We're about to move into the second phase of the plan. We've made progress. The reps who are vaccinated are in. They're in working. We've managed to do our budget, do significant bills. We did a major ARPA piece, which included our money and the federal money. We've kept as seamless as possible the work that needed to be done in the Commonwealth. So.